Hey everyone, and welcome back to 2BeLikeChrist. We're out here in social distancing land, staying away from people. If you are watching this later on, this is actually during March of 2020, during the coronavirus pandemic, and so we're out here, found a place, and there is nobody for a long ways. So we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 2. Before we do that, if you haven't picked up the notes online, the same notes that I'm reading off of, go to the website, 2BeLikeChrist.com. I'll leave a link down below or up above if you're on Facebook, and you can grab these notes. And if you haven't already, read the chapter. It's a good thing to do before we start. But if not, we're going to read it anyway. So Matthew chapter 2. So we already talked about in Matthew chapter 1 how Matthew starts off his book with a genealogy to credential Jesus as being a genuine candidate for being the Messiah. And in the very first part of Matthew chapter 2, we're going to see another example of how he lays out his case for Jesus' legitimacy. So let's read verse 1. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." So you might read somebody's biography, and it mentions where they were born, and most of the time it's meaningless information, just kind of like a fun fact. But here it's not meaningless at all, because the Jews expected that Jesus was going to come from Bethlehem because of a prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Their expectation is seen in John chapter 7, verse 42, where it says, "Has not the scripture said that Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" So there was an anticipation that he was coming from Bethlehem. That comes from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who art too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be a ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." So, in saying and stating that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he's laying another piece of his case for Jesus' legitimacy. Now let's read verses 2 through 6. Well, we better read verse 1 again, just to kind of keep the flow. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who was born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where Christ was to be born. And they told him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So again, a quotation of that verse in Micah. So in this chapter, there's not a whole lot of nitty-gritty doctrinal details to dig into. It's a lot of narrative, and it's a story that most of us are familiar with. And so I'm just going to hit some of the high points, some of the interesting historical facts, too, that help us to understand this chapter a little bit better. So, who is Herod? This would be a reference to Herod the Great, who was a ruler in Palestine in about 40 years before Jesus and a little bit into the very beginning of Jesus' life, but he was gone before Jesus became an adult. I have a really detailed video on Herod the Great on my channel that you can search for. I'll try to leave a link if I can remember. And that'll give you a lot more details, but just for now, we'll just say a few key points. He reigned for 34 years in Judea. He was actually a half Jew. I believe it was his mother who was from Idumea, which is southeast of the land of Palestine. And he convinced the Romans that he was able to keep peace in Palestine, and he was given authority because he convinced them of that. And one really interesting note and terrible note about Herod the Great was that he was a really gruesome individual. He killed many people. He even killed many of his own family. He was always concerned that people were going to, or his relatives were going to overthrow him and try to take his power. And so he killed his sons. He killed one of his wives. He was really a mess. So that's the guy who is in political control when Jesus is born into the world. And then he's kind of underneath the Roman Empire, which is leading the world at this point. So then we have this introduction to these wise men, and these are really interesting characters in the Bible. because we don't know hardly anything about them. It just says that they're wise men, and they show up here and they don't show up again anywhere in the scriptures. And how vague the scriptures are about these men is really interesting, but there's some interesting facts that are revealed in that vagueness as well. So we don't have a whole lot of details. We don't even know how many there were. It's commonly thought that there are 3 wise men, but the Bible text doesn't actually say that. That's assumed because they brought three gifts to Jesus, but it might have been 10 or 15 or, I don't know, 2. So there's plural, but we don't know how many. And so, to my knowledge, there is no mention of these wise men in prophecy or of the star that they see when they come to locate the Christ. There's no prophecy to my knowledge, and correct me if you know of one, that references this. And so, again, we just don't have very many details, and that's interesting because it does reveal something to us that is confirmed in some other biblical scriptures, and that is that it seems like God had some dealings with and even gave some revelation to nations that were not Jewish. For those of us who have been Bible students for a long time, we think about God's dealings in the Old Testament, and we think that pretty much they all have to do with the Jews or relate to the Jews somehow. And here we find that apparently God has given some kind of revelation to these wise men who are from the east. We don't know how far east they came from, but he's spoken with them somehow and given them this information. And so God had dealings with people who weren't Jews in the Old Testament, and that's confirmed through some other biblical stories as well. You think about Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a priest of God, but he's a priest of God before the priesthood is even established, because he meets up with Abraham, and Levi, through whom the priesthood would come, he's not even born yet, right? So God has some other dealing over here with priests that isn't revealed to us in the scriptures. I think about Jonah and Nineveh. God sends him to Nineveh, and you think, well, why? Why is God sending prophets to a Gentile nation and a Gentile city? We don't know exactly why, but apparently God had some dealings with those who were not Jews. I think it's important to remember that the Bible is a narrowed-in perspective of God's work with the Jews for the plan of redemption. God in the Bible is kind of notorious for only giving us what we need to know and not everything that we're curious about. And so we find out through these circumstances, like the wise men, that perhaps God had a lot of dealings with other people, but we're just not privy to them because he's only telling us the story of the Jews. Redemption is going to come through the Jews, and that's what's important for us to know. And so he just leaves the other details out, even though we're really curious about what those are. So just an interesting point that we can kind of pick up on there. You notice that the wise men arrive after Jesus' birth, and so as we read down through this chapter, you can actually find out that it's a little while after the birth of Jesus that the wise men arrive on the scene. And so they're probably not at the manger like all the pictures we see around Christmas time. They probably arrived later on, and I imagine Jesus' parents weren't keen to hang around the manger much longer than they had to, so they probably met him elsewhere. All right, let's read verses 7 through 12. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go, search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So Herod asked these wise men, he said he wants to know when the star showed up, and then when he finds out that the king of the Jews is supposed to be born, that this is a sign of his coming, consistent with Herod's character, he's concerned that someone is coming to overthrow him. And so he sends the wise men secretly to find the child. Then he wants them to come back so that they'll report where the child is so that he can kill him, get rid of him, get rid of the threat. So after departing from Herod, the star appeared, and they led them to the house of Jesus, or the house that Jesus was in. And they presented him with gifts. And I thought it was interesting. We know what gold is, obviously. That's not a secret to anyone in the modern world. But most of us, unless we're into oils, probably don't have a great grasp on what frankincense is and what myrrh is and where they come from. And so I included just a little bit of information on that. Thought it was interesting. So both of them come from a tree, and they're the resin that comes out of a tree. And I've included in the notes some pictures there. Frankincense comes from the Boswellia tree. And there's a bunch of different varieties of that tree, but it lives in West Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and India, and so kind of all around that Bible land. And then you'll see there a picture of it growing out in the desert, so it must be pretty hardy. And then the resin, when it's dried, looks like that second picture there on the notes, kind of like little yellow rocks. And then myrrh also is a resin that's extracted from a tree, and it's used in perfumes and incense, and I read that it can also be mixed with wine to become a painkiller, or people used it almost as like a drug. So you'd have alcohol, which is a depressant, and then you have this like pain-killing effect in the myrrh, and you mix those two together, and a lot of people drank it as like a recreational kind of drug. So this is native to Somalia, Oman, Yemen, and Ethiopia. So kind of the same areas there, that far east northern African area, and then Arabian Peninsula. And then the picture of kind of the tree, the thorns on that tree is there, and then the resin, dried up resin is pictured there as well. So the wise men apparently didn't know that they had been duped by Herod or what he was planning to do, and so God appears to them, and he actually tells them, don't go back to Herod, go home another way. And so they do, and Herod never finds out about the child. So he's going to take alternative measures to try to extinguish the threat, and we're going to read about that in verses 13 through 15, or actually 16 through 18. Okay, so let's take a look at verses 13 through 15, and this will be, I think, the first map that we've had in our notes. I like maps. I know a lot of people hate maps, but to really get a grasp of the Bible, you've got to at least tolerate maps. If I can give somebody just some simple advice on geography, it's just to have a basic understanding of the biblical land. It'll really help you understand the Bible so much better, and it brings a lot of insights that you wouldn't otherwise come across. So let's read verses 13 through 15. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. So God appears to the wise men, and he tells them not to return to Herod. He then appears to Joseph, and he says, you need to flee because Herod is going to try to kill Jesus. And so he does that, and you'll see on the map there kind of the journey. He obviously didn't go straight through the sea, but that's where he was headed, down from Palestine into Egypt, which is about 250 miles. So no quick trek, and especially not for somebody who had just had a baby. So that's where he's going. He's going down into Egypt, and it's, again, to fulfill the prophecy as listed in verse 15, Out of Egypt I called my son. So again, to the Jews, that's an important point. If Jesus had indeed come up out of Egypt, that would fulfill a qualification that probably not many people could have claimed. So in what we find out is that Herod then dies, finally, and wait, we're missing something. Oh no, it's going to be in the next couple verses. So they go down into Egypt, and they were probably not there more than a few years. And what we see in the next couple verses is what Herod does, but Herod will die probably not more than a couple years after they go down to Egypt. They're probably not in Egypt very long, but they're down there for protection from what's in verse 16 through 18. And then Herod, when he heard that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Okay, so there's quite a bit in these couple verses here. When Herod realized that he had been tricked, his plan is one that's just terrible. It's basically genocide of babies 2 years old and under. And he says he came up with that age range based on the time that the wise men had come to him. So there's apparently a good bit of time here between the birth of Jesus and when this takes place. Because he kind of rounds it off to 2 years. Probably guessed a little high just to be careful, but a good section of time here. It's not something that happens, overnight probably. So he's basically going to kill any male child 2 years old and under. And so he actually does this. He goes about it and kills these children. And there's a lot of Bible critics who say that this event never happened. You'll hear that quite a bit. Herod never did this because they can't find any secular record of this genocide. And I think there's several reasons to reject that and to say that this is legitimate, did happen. The first one is it's completely consistent with the character of Herod the Great. There is no real historian who would argue that this would be out of character, that he wouldn't be capable of doing something this terrible. He did some horrible things, and this would not be out of the ordinary for him, especially considering he was so worried about people threatening his throne. All right, so then I think the second reason is just basically that the Bible has been challenged and criticized over and over and over again when secular history falls short of being able to confirm the biblical records. And over and over and over again, as new discoveries have been made, the Bible has been confirmed to be true. And so even if we don't have any secular record or any record exterior to the Bible right now, the possibility that could arise sometime in the future seems very high. And the Bible itself has proven that it can be trusted as a historically accurate document. The testing that the Bible has been through has been more rigorous than any other historical document. People only criticize it because of the implications of accepting its truth. So there's no reason to question that this event actually happened. There's a prophecy in verse 18, another one. You notice how many of these Matthew throws in here. And it's a little tricky to understand maybe, but let's read it again. It says, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because there are no more. So Rachel was one of the mothers of the 12 tribes. She was married to Jacob. Leah was kind of her counterpart. It was her sister, but also kind of her she was kind of the other mother of the 12 tribes. And so Rachel was very prominent in the lineage of the 12 tribes, obviously. So she's kind of their mother, and we need a little Old Testament history to be able to understand this prophecy. So Rachel died when she was giving birth, and she was buried in the territory of Benjamin around a place called Ramah, which is a city that's north of Jerusalem. In your map, I highlighted that for you. So take a look at the notes there. And her and Jacob at that time, her husband, were traveling to Bethlehem, the city where Jesus is now being born in. You can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 2, Genesis chapter 35, verse 16 through 21, and Genesis 48, verse 7. Those references are in your notes. And this is a prophecy that comes from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. So Rachel lives back in Genesis. This prophecy is in Jeremiah, and now it's being quoted in Matthew. What's going on here? So just keep in mind, Rachel is representative of kind of the mother of the nation, and she's weeping because of the sorrow of her children. Why is this quoted in Jeremiah? Well, because the first time this is fulfilled or used to talk about a mother weeping for her children is when her children, the nation of Judah, gets taken away into captivity in Babylon. She's weeping because her children have been unfaithful to God, and now they're being punished and they're suffering. And so a mother weeps for her children. That's why it's in Jeremiah. But now he's quoting it again as really a second fulfillment, in that the children of Rachel, right, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Rachel, the babies, are being killed because of Herod's cruelty. And so they're suffering, and you can imagine the mothers who were suffering in Judah because of this event. And so there's this weeping because of the destruction of her people. And you'll notice that Bethlehem is just south of Ramah, and when Herod did this terrible thing, he was killing babies all in that region. And so that region would have been affected by his slaughter. And so you find Rachel in her tomb not far away from Bethlehem, weeping because of the slaughter that's going on all around her. So that's kind of how that prophecy ties in. All right, so then we got our last section of Scripture here, and that's 19 through 23. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and he took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled, that he should be called a Nazarene. Okay, so the angel appears to Joseph after Herod dies, and he says, all right, Herod's dead. He's not seeking the child's life anymore. You can go back to your homeland. So that's what Joseph does. Instead of going back to Bethlehem, he actually goes up north to Nazareth. And I don't have a map in the notes right now, but I'll add one to show you where Nazareth is, to show you where Galilee is. And it says that the reason that he went there was because he was afraid of a man named Archelaus, who was the son of Herod. So to understand who Archelaus is, you got to dig a little bit more into the history of this whole time period. The Herods, it's a title, not just a name of a single individual. So there was Herod the Great, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and they were all related and ruled Judea for a time. And so Archelaus, Herod the Great's son, has now assumed the throne, and Joseph's afraid of him, so he moves locations. So Archelaus is actually okay, so you have, this isn't going to work. The dirt is too dry. New plan. Herod the Great. Now from him, you've got Archelaus. So this is the guy that we're talking about. Archelaus. Now he has a brother named Antipas. This is in your notes if you want a more clear rendition. And then they also have a half-brother named Philip. Okay, so Herod the Great, he died, right? He died. Death, that's what death looks like. And then Archelaus is now on the throne. And this is who Joseph is afraid of. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, you may recognize some other names here, and namely Philip. So these two guys actually have kind of a strange relationship. You'll read about Philip in Matthew chapter 14, verse 1 through 4. We'll read about that later, but it says, he's the one who John the Baptist, who killed John the Baptist, Philip is. Wait, let me make sure I got that right. No, okay, I got that wrong. All right, so this is the guy who kills John the Baptist, Antipas does. And the reason is because he's married to a guy, he's married to a girl. Philip was married to a lady named Herodias. All right, so these two were married. But what happened was Herodias actually left Philip and went over here, and she wanted to be married to Antipas. And so John the Baptist condemned this relationship between Herodias and Antipas. And do you remember what happened? Herodias gets her daughter to ask Antipas to kill John because Herodias is angry that John has condemned her. Because it was actually Herodias who decided to leave, not Philip who put her away. So she did this thing, and Josephus even writes, you'll see the quote in your notes, he says Herodias took upon her to confound the laws of our country and divorced herself from her husband while he was alive and was married to Herod Antipas. So she did this thing, and that's right, they're brother-in-laws, right? So here's this woman like bouncing around husbands, but it's like within the same family. And even Josephus is like, this is not right. Josephus was a first century historian. He's not even a Christian, and he's like, this is not right. And so that's how that all plays in. So the guy in charge right now is Archelaus, but these other characters, Philip and Antipas, have a role, a much lesser role in the Gospel of Matthew, but it's interesting to see how they're kind of all related. And so Archelaus reigned for 9 years after the death of his father, before he was removed by Caesar Augustus, or Octavian, when he came to be the Caesar of the Roman Empire. And following his removal, after 9 years, the land of Israel became a formal province of Rome, and that's when it took the name Judea. So, I hope that my beautiful drawings here have helped you understand a little bit. And you can take a look at the notes for a little better clarification. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in 2 days when we do Matthew chapter 3.